There are places in this world that do not belong to time, places where the past and present blur, and the line between the living and the dead grows thin. Hollow Point was one such place. Perched on jagged cliffs above a restless sea, the village clung to existence like the salt-stained timbers of its weathered houses clung to the crumbling rock. Time seemed to forget Hollow Point, but the forest at its edge, the Wilderwood, did not. For centuries, the Wilderwood had cast its shadow over the village, a dark and ancient presence that loomed in every whispered legend and fireside tale. The villagers spoke of it only in hushed tones, their voices heavy with fear. They told of a forest that breathed, that watched, that whispered secrets too dark to be known. They warned of the hollow ones, twisted shadows said to dwell within, feeding on the souls of the unwary. To outsiders, such stories might seem the fanciful fears of a superstitious people, a way to explain the unexplained. But to those who lived in Hollow Point, the stories were warnings, unheeded at great peril. The Wilderwood had taken before, and it would take again. The coastal winds screamed like tormented souls through the narrow, twisted streets of Hollow Point. Each gust carried the briny sting of the sea, lashing against weathered houses that leaned precariously into one another. The village, perched on the edge of jagged cliffs, seemed to shiver under the weight of its own decay, teetering between life and ruin. Hollow Point had always felt removed from the flow of time, as if it existed in a world parallel to the one that had moved on. Elias Holloway paused mid-stride, lantern in hand, and adjusted his scarf against the biting cold. His boots crunched against uneven cobblestones, their echoes swallowed by the dense fog curling through the streets like a living thing. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, the sea roared its ceaseless song. He turned his gaze toward the lighthouse towering above the village. It loomed dark and skeletal, its shattered windows staring emptily out to sea. Once, its light had been the pride of Hollow Point, guiding ships to safety. Now, it stood as a grim monument to everything the village had lost.
"Elias, supper's getting cold."
Marin's voice rang faintly from their cottage at the street's end, carried on the wind like a lifeline against the gloom. Elias turned, squinting to catch a glimpse of her silhouette framed in the doorway's golden light. She stood with her hands on her hips, her auburn hair catching the glow from the hearth inside. He raised his lantern in response, a faint smile tugging at his lips. As he started toward home, the low murmur of villagers reached his ears, uneasy voices whispering of strange happenings. He hesitated near the edge of the town square, where a small group had gathered under the crooked sign of the Rusted Anchor Tavern. The light spilling from its windows cast long, uneven shadows over the cobblestones. "Another goat gone missing," muttered old Tom, hunched over his walking stick. His voice was rough with age and salted by decades of hard living. "Third this week. Mark my words, it's the Wilderwood." "Wolves, more likely," scoffed Marta, the baker, though her hands trembled as she folded them across her apron. "The forest's not magic, Tom." "You think wolves drag animals clean off without a sound?" Tom shot back, his rheumy eyes narrowing. He leaned closer to Marta, his gnarled hands trembling as he pointed toward the forest's edge. "You've heard the whispers, haven't you?" Marta shifted uneasily, her bravado faltering. "Whispers don't mean anything. It's just the wind." "The wind doesn't call your name," Tom replied, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. The group fell silent, their eyes darting toward the shadowed tree line that loomed just beyond the last row of houses. Elias stepped closer, his lantern casting flickering light over the group. "Enough, Tom," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The storm's bad enough without your stories making it worse. Let's focus on keeping everyone safe." Tom's gaze lingered on Elias for a moment, his expression a mix of defiance and something else, fear. "Mark my words, boy," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The forest is hungry. Don't let it take what's yours." Elias said nothing, though Tom's words followed him like a shadow as he continued homeward. The comforting smell of salt cod stew greeted Elias as he stepped into his cottage. The warmth of the hearth was a sharp contrast to the damp chill outside. Marin turned from the stove, her auburn hair catching the golden light of the fire. She smiled, but her sharp eyes flicked to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass, relentless and heavy. "You're late," she said, ladling stew into a bowl and placing it on the table. "Got caught up listening to old Tom and his tales of the Wilderwood," Elias replied, hanging his coat by the door. He lowered his lantern onto the table, its faint light flickering before settling. "Another goat missing." Marin frowned, setting her ladle down with a quiet clink. "That's not just superstition, Elias. Something's out there. Maybe wolves. Or just Tom's imagination running wild again," Elias said, though his tone lacked conviction. He reached for the bowl and took a small sip, savoring the warmth as it chased away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. Marin lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly. "Wolves don't whisper in the dark, Elias, and you know it." He looked up sharply, his spoon halting midair. "You're starting to sound like Tom." "Am I?" Marin's voice grew quieter, the words heavy. "Or maybe we're both just saying what everyone else is afraid to. The forest feels different, Elias. It feels like it's watching." Before Elias could respond, a bright voice cut through the tension. "Papa, did you bring me something from the village?" Lila's head peeked around the corner, her auburn curls bouncing as she darted into the room. Elias chuckled, patting his lap. "Just a story tonight," he said, his voice lightening as Lila clambered onto his knees. "It's about a watchman who faces down a terrible storm." Lila giggled, clutching his hair. "That's silly. No one can fight the sea." "Ah, but courage is stronger than the sea," Elias replied, his tone deep and playful. But beneath his mirth, a shadow lingered in his mind, a dark, gnawing worry he couldn't shake. After supper, when Lila was asleep, Elias lingered by the window, staring out into the encroaching fog. Marin joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're worried," she said softly. "It's just Tom's stories, I suppose," he replied, though his tone betrayed him. He let out a sigh, placing his hand over hers. "The forest feels closer lately. Have you noticed?" Marin nodded, her expression tight with unspoken fear. "It's like it's breathing, like it's alive." The storm came suddenly, a howling tempest that rattled the shutters and sent waves crashing harder against the cliffs. Rain lashed against the rooftops, and the wind's wail rose to a deafening crescendo. Elias patrolled the village as usual, his lantern cutting weak beams through the swirling fog. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds the storm's fury and the occasional creak of a weathered sign. As he neared the edge of the village, a sound stopped him cold. Laughter, faint, high-pitched, and unmistakable. "Lila." The name slipped out, carried away by the wind. Heart hammering, Elias turned toward the Wilderwood, its gnarled trees stark against the dim glow of his lantern. His breath fogged in the air as he called again, louder this time. "Lila!" A faint giggle answered, chilling him to the bone. Elias's breath hitched as the laughter echoed again, fading into the trees. He took a step back, his lantern quivering in his grasp. The Wilderwood stood like a living wall before him, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. "Lila!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The wind swallowed his call, but the faint giggle returned, distant and teasing. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned and bolted toward his cottage, the storm's fury driving him onward. The door hung ajar, swaying on its hinges. Rain had pooled in the entryway, muddy footprints leading out into the night. "Marin!" he bellowed, bursting into the house. She stumbled from their bedroom, her face pale and drawn. "What's wrong? Elias, what is it?" "She's gone," Elias choked out, pointing to the open door. "Lila, she's out there. I heard her." Marin's face contorted with fear as her gaze dropped to the footprints. "The forest," she whispered, clutching the doorframe. "Oh, Elias, no, not the forest." "I'll find her." His voice was resolute, though terror gnawed at the edges of his mind. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." Marin grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his coat. "No, you can't go out there. Not in this storm. Not into that place." "She's out there, Marin," he said, pulling free of her grasp. "I have to." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Promise me you'll come back. Both of you." Elias hesitated, his heart breaking at the sight of her fear. He placed a hand on her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I promise." Then he turned and stepped into the storm, the door slamming shut behind him. The forest swallowed him whole, its ancient trees pressing in from all sides. Their branches reached for him like skeletal fingers, dripping with rain that tasted of iron. Each step felt heavier than the last, the sodden earth sucking at his boots. The lantern's light flickered, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. "Lila!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from the cold and his mounting panic. "Lila, where are you?" The whispers started slowly, a soft murmur that seemed to drift between the trees. "Elias, Lila." He stopped dead in his tracks, the hair on his neck standing on end. The voices weren't carried by the wind. They were too deliberate, too close. He turned in a slow circle, the lantern trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice faltering. The forest answered with silence. Then, just ahead, he saw it. A pale, flickering light. Relief surged through him, his heart leaping. "Lila!" he called, running toward the glow. But as he drew closer, dread began to creep in. The light wasn't warm or golden. It was cold and bluish, casting unnatural shadows that danced and writhed across the forest floor. The outline of a figure emerged, tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by a deep hood. It held a lantern, identical to his own, the light within shifting unnaturally, as if alive. "You've come," the figure said, its voice low and resonant, like the groan of ancient wood. "She is waiting." Elias froze, his breath catching. "Where is she? What have you done with my daughter?" The figure tilted its head, the movement unnatural, insect-like. "She has joined them. The Hollow Ones." "No," Elias whispered, his blood running cold. "You're lying. She's just a child." "Children wander," the figure replied, its tone almost mocking. "They are drawn by the forest's whispers, by promises of play and wonder. But the forest takes what it is owed." Elias stepped forward, his voice rising in anger. "I won't leave without her. Tell me where she is." The figure raised an arm, bony fingers pointing deeper into the forest. "Go then, but you will not find her as she was." Elias didn't hesitate. He pushed past the figure, the lantern's dim light illuminating the path ahead. The whispers grew louder, swelling into a chorus that clawed at his mind. Shadows flitted at the edge of his vision, darting between the trees like predators circling their prey. And then he saw her. "Lila!" he cried, his voice breaking as he stumbled into a small clearing. She stood at its center, her back to him, her auburn curls glistening with the cold, unnatural light. Relief surged through him, but as he approached, his steps faltered. She turned slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. Her once bright eyes were now hollow voids, dark veins spreading beneath her pallid skin. Her lips moved, but no words came, only a raspy, inhuman breath. "Lila, no," Elias whispered, dropping to his knees. Tears blurred his vision as he reached for her. "It's me, it's Papa. Come home. Come." The shadows around the clearing began to move, coalescing into figures. They were tall and faceless, their bodies twisted and contorted. The hollow ones. They circled him and his daughter, their empty gazes fixed on the lantern he still clutched. "She is theirs now," the figure's voice intoned, echoing from the shadows. "And so are you, watchman." Elias tightened his grip on the lantern, his heart breaking as Lila stared at him with those empty eyes. He stood, his voice trembling with both rage and despair. "If you want me, then take me, but let her go." The forest fell silent. Then, one by one, the hollow ones turned their heads toward him. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and terrible. "You cannot save her," the voice whispered, "but you can join her." Elias looked at Lila one last time, his tears falling freely. "I'll always protect you," he whispered. Then, with trembling hands, he raised the lantern high and let it fall. The light shattered, plunging the clearing into utter darkness. The figure stood motionless, the bluish light emanating from its form casting eerie, flickering patterns on the surrounding trees. Elias froze, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to call out, to demand answers, but the words died on his tongue. The figure turned slowly, its movements unnaturally fluid, like water flowing against the pull of gravity. "Lila," he whispered again, though the name felt futile, swallowed by the forest's oppressive silence. The figure raised an arm, bony fingers extending to point deeper into the Wilderwood. The air grew colder, the frost biting at Elias's cheeks and numbing his fingers as he tightened his grip on the lantern. The whispering began again, louder now, threading its way into his mind like creeping vines. "Follow, follow." Elias's heart warred with his instincts. Every rational part of him screamed to run, to turn back to the warmth of the village and the safety of Marin's arms. But the thought of Lila, alone, frightened, calling for him, drove his feet forward. The figure glided away, its light fading as it moved deeper into the shadows. Elias stumbled after it, pushing through tangled undergrowth and low-hanging branches. The forest seemed to close in around him, the path disappearing as roots and brambles clawed at his legs. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming a dissonant chorus that seemed to mock his desperation. He broke through a dense thicket and into a small clearing. The air here was heavy, almost suffocating, and the ground was unnaturally smooth, devoid of grass or leaves. In the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any he had ever seen. Its trunk was black as pitch, twisted and gnarled, with roots that clawed at the earth like grasping hands. The branches stretched upward in grotesque contortions, their tips dripping with a thick, dark sap that hissed as it hit the ground. Hanging from the lowest branch was a bundle, swaying gently in the cold, unnatural breeze. Elias's stomach churned as he stepped closer, the lantern's light illuminating the object. It was Lila's doll, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye staring blankly at him. The whispers fell silent. "Lila!" he cried, his voice breaking with raw anguish. He tore the doll from the branch, clutching it to his chest. The forest seemed to respond, the trees groaning as though alive, their branches creaking and shifting. "Papa!" The voice was faint, fragile, but unmistakably Lila's. Elias whirled around, his eyes scanning the clearing. "Lila, where are you?" "Papa!" The voice came again, closer this time. It seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Elias turned toward the sound and saw her, a small figure standing at the edge of the clearing, her auburn curls glinting in the ghostly light. Relief surged through him, but it was quickly replaced by dread. Her movements were wrong, her head tilted unnaturally to one side as if her neck couldn't bear its weight. Her eyes, once warm and bright, were now wide and unblinking, reflecting the cold light of the forest. "Lila," he whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. She smiled, a brittle, lifeless curve of her lips. "You shouldn't have come, Papa." Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. "Lila, come here. We're going home." Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of sorrow that seemed far too ancient for her young face. "It won't let me go," she said softly. "It won't let any of us go." The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, pale, twisted figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Elias stumbled backward, his lantern swinging wildly. "Stay away!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. Lila extended her hand toward him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Run, Papa, please, run!" The figures lunged, and Elias turned, his instincts finally overtaking his fear. He ran blindly through the forest, the whispers and laughter chasing him, the lantern's light flickering and threatening to die. The trees seemed to shift and move, blocking his path, guiding him deeper into the heart of the Wilderwood. He tripped over a root and fell hard, the lantern shattering against the ground. Darkness closed in around him, suffocating and absolute. The whispers grew louder, forming words he could finally understand. "You will never leave. You are ours now." A pale hand reached for him from the shadows, impossibly long fingers brushing against his face. Elias screamed, the sound echoing through the forest before being swallowed whole. And then, silence. Back in the village, Marin stood at the window, her hands trembling as she clutched Lila's favorite scarf. The storm had passed, but the forest loomed darker than ever, its shadow stretching over the cliffs like a shroud. She waited through the night, her heart heavy with the weight of a promise broken. The people of Hollow Point never saw Elias or Lila again. On stormy nights, some claimed to hear his voice calling her name, a desperate cry carried by the wind. Others swore they saw a faint, flickering light moving through the Wilderwood, as though a lantern swayed in unseen hands. The villagers no longer whispered about the Hollow Ones. They didn't need to. Their fear lived in the silences, in the way they avoided the forest's edge, and in the unspoken truth that the Wilderwood had claimed another soul. The tale of Elias Holloway, the Lantern Keeper, became legend. Travelers spoke of a ghostly light that lured the unwary into the Wilderwood, where shadows danced and whispered promises they could not keep. Those who followed the light were never seen again. And so, the village of Hollow Point grew quieter, its streets empty, its people bound by fear and loss. The Wilderwood remained, its secrets locked away, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to venture into its depths. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to give this video a like and share it with others who love a good scare. And don't forget to subscribe to the Midnight Broadcast for more terrifying stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay safe and beware of the shadows.